So now let's talk a little bit about Israel and some of the reaction in the UK. We've just had at the weekend several hostages discovered murdered in Rafah, and barely a few days later, the UK government suspended its arms export licenses to Israel. Now, we're delighted to be joined from Israel, from Jerusalem, by Jake Wallis Simons, friend of the show. Hi, Jake. Welcome.
Hello. Good evening.
Now, Jake, do you want to tell us a little bit about the reaction in Israel to Labour's announcement this week?
Nobody cared. Nobody cared for two reasons. Firstly was the timing of the announcement, which came at the deepest day of anguish for Israel for some time. The funerals of those 6 hostages who were executed underground by Hamas a few days ago. And that really hit Israelis hard. Although there's been lots of death and destruction over the last 10 months, this was a particularly low moment because I think the country had allowed itself to hope that we'd see them again, that there'd be a deal, that they'd be released. But sadly, tragically, Hamas butchered them underground when the IDF was approaching. And that hit everyone here hard. And that was the day of the funeral when David Lammy chose to make that announcement that he was suspending those 30 export licenses for armaments to Israel. That was the first reason why nobody cared. But the second reason why nobody cared is that it makes absolutely zero difference to Israel's ability to prosecute the war. Israel only buys 1% of its foreign arms purchases from the UK, and the arms licenses that David Lammy suspended were 10% of the 1%. And so it makes negligible difference to Israel in terms of its ability to defend itself, and that's what people really care about here. On a diplomatic level, of course, it does have an impact. Israel and Britain have a very powerful strategic security relationship in terms of intelligence sharing and technology sharing as well, which has saved lives on both sides. Arguably, one could say that Britain has benefited more from that relationship than Israel has. There's a big question mark over what's going to happen with that now. And of course, the Americans were unimpressed that Lammy had made that move because that went in front of the Americans who haven't done the same thing. But I think that domestically really is where this had the biggest impact in terms of its effect on Britain's Jewish community, who are feeling quite vulnerable at the moment for all the obvious reasons. The chief rabbi gave a quite unprecedented statement saying that it beggared belief that David Lammy would not only suspend these arms sales, but do it on that day of mourning in Israel. And there's some concern about the direction of travel that the Labour government is beginning to take with restarting the funding to UNRWA, the UN agency that looks after the Palestinians, regardless of the fact that many of them have been found to have taken part in the October the 7th massacres, and of course supporting that criminal case against Netanyahu and the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. So these are all signals that the Labour government might be fracturing its support for the Jewish state. And having been here on the ground and seen how the army is operating, seen how the decision-making process is made for every single strike, I know from first-hand experience that the army is taking extraordinary measures to try to protect civilian life. But the opposite impression is given by Hamas's propaganda, which is blared out on our TV screens and across social media, affecting public opinion and whipping up the electorate in Britain, particularly those of Muslim origin, placing huge pressure on David Lammy to cater to their demands as well. So I can see why he's made the decision, but it really is no way to make foreign policy. And I hope that wiser heads will prevail in the coming weeks.
And in terms of so people have a sense, it is unusual for a government to suspend any arms export licenses. I mean, there are many more unsavory regimes around the world that we're quite happy to arm. And yet we are, David Lammy is calling out Israel, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I had a look at some of the figures over the last 3 years or so. Britain has sold Qatar, which is the world's foremost sponsor of Sunni jihadism, and of course is the main sort of supporter of Hamas. We sold them £3.1 billion of arms. We sold the Saudis £1.9 billion of arms, regardless of the fact that they're prosecuting the war in Yemen in a way that doesn't give much concern for civilian casualties, shall we say. We've sold Turkey almost £800 million, regardless of their similar attitude towards massacring the Kurds. We've sold Egypt 318 million worth of arms, regardless of the fact that they're deeply corrupt, a police state, and a hugely authoritarian one at that. And by comparison to all of those, Israel comes in at £83 million, so far smaller. And it happens to be the only democracy in the Middle East that's making every effort to preserve civilian life while it fights for the lives of its own citizens, both in Israel and the hostages in Gaza, against a jihadi foe that has attacked us in the past and would think nothing of beheading us here at home in Britain or where you are, as well as the Israelis in Israel. So it really does seem like the moral compass is slightly awry here with this performative move to suspend the arms licenses. And I think that one of the spin-offs of it is it invites scrutiny of the other regimes to which we sell arms, none of whom have covered themselves in glory.
You've mentioned that the announcement has backfired to a certain extent. It wouldn't make any real military difference. But as well as sending, a bad signal to our allies, doesn't it also embolden our enemies and Israel's enemies?
Yeah, exactly. It will add to the encouragement to Hamas that it's on the right track. The Hamas strategy is very, very clear indeed. Even a child could see it looking from the outside. It has no regard for its own civilians or for the lives of its own fighters. Therefore, it places civilians in harm's way to try to get them killed, to produce the propaganda pictures that we see on our TV screens, to inflame public opinion in the West, bring people out onto the streets, place political pressure on their leaders, which then goes through to Jerusalem, and in an attempt to force Israel to stop the campaign before getting rid of Hamas. It's very clear. I mean, one thing which I would encourage viewers to ask themselves is, when did you last turn on your TV or look at social media and see one single international broadcasting network sharing an image or footage of a dead Hamas fighter or a wounded Hamas fighter? You only ever see dead and wounded civilians. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that Hamas censors all the footage that's allowed to come out of Gaza. And that's merrily pumped out by BBC, CNN, Sky, without informing viewers of this censorship. It's absolutely reprehensible. Viewers at home in Britain and across the West are getting a highly partial image of the war, which doesn't correspond to reality, that's whipping up people's aggression towards Israel and getting them to believe in this Hamas narrative that Israel's carrying out a genocide when it is doing anything but. And it does seem like when it filters through to political decision-making that are hostile to Israel, that encourages Hamas to think, well, this strategy is working. International opinion is turning against Israel. We've just got to keep on going, not give them a deal, and sooner or later, Israel will be forced to stop before we're all dead, and we can get on with planning the next October the 7th.
Mm-hmm. Tom, do you want to add anything here?
Well, I think just to tack on to what Jake was saying there about the tremendous lack of moral clarity, I guess, from our own government, as well as various Western governments on this. I mean, it's been shown up by this decision by David Lammy, which on the one hand kind of reeks of student politics to a certain extent. It was, it's when every so often, Oxford University Students' Union would, pass a motion condemning the Israeli government as if the Knesset would shake as a consequence. There is an element of that, but at the same time, you're exactly right, Jake, the signal this sends, and you can already see it in the sort of Israelophobic Twitter sphere, the way in which this is already being used to say even this quite middle of the road Labour British government have turned on Israel, we're starting to sour on Israel. Isn't that, grist to our mill? That's already been really clear. And I suppose also the point about the hostages and the brutal killing of those hostages found in a tunnel in Rafah, it has also reminded us of the tremendous lack of moral clarity that the Democratic administration in America have had on this question, because the fact that Kamala Harris, now running to be the president of the United States, was at the forefront and wanted it to be known that she was at the forefront of trying to pull Israel back from going into Rafah, trying to delay that offensive. And yet we now know why Israel was so intent on going into that place, not only because it was a site of operation for Hamas, but also because their hostages were there. So it's been a reminder of the extent to which really grubby domestic political concerns, whether or not the Democrats are going to be able to carry Michigan in November, have got in the way of siding with an ally as it fights a barbaric Islamist foe. I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you about, though, Jake, is there's been a lot of focus in the commentary over here about the domestic response in Israel, not to David Lammy and whatever he's up to, but to the hostages themselves, the protests that we've seen, the strikes that we've seen. Could you give us a bit of a sense of where Israeli public opinion is at the moment in terms of this war, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, the debate at the heart of this is a hugely serious and consequential one, of the like that we don't really get involved with in Britain because we have the luxury of being free from that kind of threat. But basically, it's a choice between getting the deal that would release some of the hostages in exchange for the Israeli military withdrawing from an area of land called the Philadelphia Corridor. And that Philadelphia Corridor is a very narrow strip of land that runs along the Gaza-Egypt border. The IDF are now in there. They've taken control of it, and they're trying to destroy the tunnels, because the significance of it is that it's through this Philadelphia corridor that hundreds of tunnels, literally hundreds of tunnels in something that's about 15 miles long, hundreds of tunnels run from Egypt into Gaza through the Philadelphia corridor. This is the lifeline of Hamas, where their armaments come through, their cash comes through, their personnel comes through. They go off to train in Malaysia, Indonesia, come back through the Philadelphia corridor, through the tunnels through there. So if you're going to destroy Hamas, you need to shut down all those tunnels in that Philadelphia corridor and make sure they're not opened again. And so the debate really is that if you want to get a deal that returns some of the hostages, Hamas is saying you've got to leave the Philadelphia corridor. You get your hostages back, but then you risk Hamas rearming, resupplying, and coming back with another October the 7th in the future. If you remain in the Philadelphia corridor, then you lose the hostages. So it's an anguished debate here. Netanyahu is in favor of keeping troops in the Philadelphia corridor. Other members of the security establishment and the political realm take the opposite view, that the more important thing is to get hostages out. And the debate around it has become so frenzied, with each side slagging off the other, accusing each other of being Hamas sympathizers or wishing to see the hostages dead. I mean, totally overblown rhetoric, because everyone's so het up about this. And it plays into the political divisions which have opened up in Israel really over the last year or year and a half, since Netanyahu formed his governing coalition with far-right members of that coalition, relying on his political support for extremists, which has caused havoc in Israeli political and civil society. And so those protests that you see are accusing Netanyahu of standing in the way of the hostage deal because he wants to keep his coalition together. So it's all quite complicated and very, very tragic and very painful here right now.
Jake, what have you been out in Israel observing? What is there anything you're allowed to tell us?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I think the most sort of relevant thing for the British debate has been that I've seen the process through which the IDF goes to approve every single airstrike that's sent into Gaza. They have a command and control room that makes the decision. They have intelligence coming in showing exactly who they're targeting and how far it is from any civilians. That's signed off by 4 separate people, officers of different ranks. But also, for every single strike, there is a legal expert, an expert in humanitarian law, who weighs up the justification for that strike against any potential harm to the infrastructure and possibly to civilians who stray into the field of fire. And that decision-making process is very tight. I went to see it with some generals, some senior military figures from Britain and the West, including a former deputy commander of NATO, who said to me that it was at least as rigorous as the process that the British Army goes through when we engage in warfare. And this is just really by way of throwing some light on the propaganda, which I mentioned earlier, which is spewed out into the West in order to turn people against our democratic ally and towards the jihadis who are trying to kill them and trying to kill us. You know, that 40,000 figure, 40,000 dead in Gaza is repeated ad nauseum. I saw it repeated by Zara Sultana on the BBC recently. It was repeated in Parliament by one of the Gaza MPs. It's totally misleading because up to half of those deaths are Hamas fighters. Between 17 and 20,000 of them are Hamas combatants. So if that's the case, and if the 40,000 figure isn't inflated by Hamas, which it probably is, frankly, then the IDF is killing one civilian for every combatant, which sounds like a lot. But in modern warfare, that's a record that is unequaled by Britain, by the Americans, by any democracy. We killed far more civilians as a ratio to combatants in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and when we defeated ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so Israel is fighting an impossible war against an implacable foe that is putting civilians in harm's way willfully in order to generate propaganda to win hearts and minds in the West for their depraved cause. And it's working because the media are cooperating with that message, not scrutinizing it enough, and pumping it out into millions of sitting rooms around the West. So I've really got an insight into the difference between the perception in the West versus the actual reality on the ground.